February 3rd, 1972. Boone, North Carolina. 51-year-old Bryce Durham, his 44-year-old wife Virginia, and their 18-year-old son Bobby Joe are found strangled and drowned inside their bathroom after an apparent home invasion. Months later, 4 suspects with a history of burglary are arrested for their alleged roles in the murders, but the charges against them are eventually dropped due to lack of evidence. Suspicion falls upon the Durham son-in-law, Troy Hall, who claimed to have received a phone call from Virginia while the murders were taking place, but there are no conclusive answers about what happened. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and we've got an odd cold case to cover today. The 1972 murders of the Durham family. This is the story of a married couple, Bryce and Virginia Durham, and their 18-year-old son Bobby Joe, who were all brutally killed inside their home by intruders. At the outset, the evidence seemed to suggest that the family were victims of a burglary gone wrong, but some investigators began to suspect that the scene may have been staged. The crime seemed to resemble a professional hit, but since the Durhams did not have any known enemies, no one could figure out what the motive might have been. Over the years, there would be some potential suspects, including 4 professional burglars who were arrested for this crime before the charges were dropped, and Troy Hall, the husband of the Durham's surviving daughter. Troy was the one who discovered the victims' bodies after claiming he received an odd phone call from his mother-in-law, but while some investigators have questioned whether this call actually took place, there was no direct evidence linking him to the crime. This is a pretty bizarre and baffling mystery, and believe it or not, it also happens to have an unlikely connection to the JFK assassination, which we'll be exploring later on in this episode. Anyway, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or a review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let's now delve into the Durham family murders. Our story begins in 1972 in Boone, North Carolina, a small town located in Watauga County near the Blue Ridge Mountains, which had a population of just under 9,000 people at that time. One of our victims is 51-year-old Baxter Bryce Durham, who goes by the name Bryce, and lives with his 44-year-old wife Virginia Durham and their 18-year-old son Bobby Joe in a split-level home located on Clyde Townsend Road. The Durhams also have a 19-year-old daughter named Ginny, who is currently married to a man named Troy Hall, and the couple live in a mobile home at a trailer park located 4 miles away from the Durham residence. The Durham family had previously lived in the town of Mount Airy, where Bryce worked as the manager for an auto loan business, but after they relocated to Boone in November of 1969, Bryce wound up running his own auto dealership, and Virginia is also employed there as a secretary and bookkeeper. At this point, Bobby Joe and Troy are both students at Appalachian State University, and while Ginny has recently dropped out, she still works a job there. On the evening of February the 3rd, Bryce attended a Rotary meeting at Appalachian Ski Mountain, a ski resort located in Blowing Rock, which would feature a military skiing demonstration by members of the Green Berets. However, the area was hit with a major snowstorm, with winds blowing up to 40 miles per hour, which meant that attendance for the meeting was poor, and it wrapped up earlier than expected, sometime between 8 o'clock and 8:15 p.m. Since the Durham residence was located at the end of a road with a steep hill, Bryce feared that his own vehicle would have trouble making it there in the terrible weather, so earlier that afternoon, he switched cars at his auto dealership. Bryce decided to borrow a brand new four-wheel drive SUV the dealership had just received, called a GMC Jimmy, as he felt it was better suited to navigate the icy roads. Bobby Joe had finished up his classes at the university, and since Bryce did not believe his son's car would have had much luck making the treacherous drive home, he asked Bobby Joe to wait for him at the dealership, where he would pick both him and Virginia up and give them a ride. One of Bryce's acquaintances agreed to follow him from the ski resort to the dealership in order to ensure he arrived safely, and he would later say that Bryce made it there at 8:30. Bryce subsequently climbed into the Jimmy with his wife and son and headed home, and neighbors would recall seeing the SUV ascending the hill towards the residence sometime around 9 o'clock. Well, nearly 2 hours later, at 10:50 p.m., the Boone Police Department received an emergency phone call informing them that a murder had taken place at the Durham residence, so they immediately headed there and went inside. When police walked into the bathroom, they were shocked to discover that the bodies of Bryce, Virginia, and Bobby Joe were all draped over the edge of the bathtub. All three victims had their hands tied behind their back, and their heads were submerged in water, and while the bathtub's faucet was still running, the overflow drain prevented the water from spilling out onto the floor. It appeared that each victim had been strangled, as Bobby Joe and Virginia had rope markings on their necks, and a nylon cord was wrapped around Bryce's neck. It would later be determined that the official cause of death for all three members of the family was strangulation, though drowning was listed as an additional cause of death for Bryce and Bobby Joe. While Bryce had a minor skull fracture and Virginia had a bloody nose, the victims did not appear to have any defensive wounds, and there were no signs of struggle. It turned out that the phone call to the police had been made by the Durham son-in-law, Troy Hall, who had traveled to the Durham residence with his wife Ginny and one of their neighbors at the trailer park, a private investigator named Cecil Small. Troy claimed that at around 10:30 p.m., he and Ginny were listening to music together at their mobile home when he received a phone call from Virginia. Even though her voice was muffled and Troy could not make out everything she was saying because of the music, Virginia told him that 3 black men were inside their house and beating up Bryce and Bobby Joe in another room. Oh, and Virginia apparently did not use the phrase black men to describe them, but used a racial slur instead. Afterward, the line suddenly went dead, and Troy told Ginny about what he heard. Even though he was inclined to believe the call was a prank, Ginny asked Troy to phone her parents' house back, but he said he kept getting a busy signal. Since they lived only 4 miles away, the couple decided they should drive there to check on them, but due to the cold weather, Troy was unable to start their car, which is why he asked Cecil Small to give them a ride. Cecil drove Troy and Ginny to the Durham residence, but since the driveway and the hill leading up to it had so much ice, he decided to park on the side of the road. Since Cecil was carrying a gun, he agreed to accompany Troy to the house while Ginny waited in the car. It turned out there was no answer at the front and rear doors, and both of them were locked, but they were able to enter the residence through the garage after Troy lifted up the door and led them to a side entrance. When they walked inside the living room, they noticed that the lights were on, the television set was on, the phone had been ripped out of the wall, and the entire house appeared to have been ransacked. Even though the Durhams were nowhere in sight, there were splotches of blood on the carpet. There was a partially eaten baked chicken on the kitchen table, and since pieces of chicken and 3 cups of soda were inside the living room, it appeared that the family had arrived home and sat down to eat and watch TV together before something happened. Troy and Cecil soon heard running water from the bathroom and decided to check inside there, and that's when they discovered the bodies of Bryce, Virginia, and Bobby Joe. After leaving the residence and informing Ginny about what happened, Troy ran to a neighbor's residence to call the police. The GMC Jimmy which Bryce drove home from the dealership was missing and appeared to have been stolen, but the North Carolina Highway Patrol soon found the abandoned SUV in the ditch by the side of Poplar Grove Road about a mile from the residence. The engine was still running, and the lights and windshield wipers were left on, and a pillowcase was found inside the vehicle containing valuable items which had been taken from the house, including some silverware. There were tire tread marks at the scene belonging to a second vehicle, which had likely followed the SUV and picked up the driver, and this seemed to indicate that multiple people were involved in the crime. On the surface, the scene resembled a burglary gone wrong, as it turned out that someone had gone through Virginia's pocketbook and Bryce and Bobby Joe's wallets. But oddly, a canvas bank deposit bag containing several $100s, which the Durhams had brought home from the dealership, was left behind at the residence, even though it was lying on a dining room chair in plain sight. There were no signs of forced entry or any footprints outside the house, though they could have been covered up by the heavy snow before police arrived. But investigators found it more surprising that they could not find any wet footprints on the carpet inside the home. The murders took everyone in the community by surprise, as the crime almost seemed to resemble a professional hit. Even though the Durhams were known for being a quiet family who mostly kept to themselves, they were also known for being friendly and didn't seem to have any enemies. The Boone Police Department, the Watauga County Sheriff's Office, and the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation all looked into several rumors about potential motives. These included Bryce being involved in illegal horse and farm dealings during his time living in Mount Airy, or him finding out about a scam involving car dealers who rolled back the mileage on vehicles before selling them to customers. However, no evidence was ever found to support any of these rumors, and they never led anywhere. But on April the 25th, 2.5 months after the murders took place, the authorities announced the arrests of 3 suspects, Jerry Ray Quesada, Dean Chandler, and Eugene Clarence Guerin, who all lived over 80 miles away in Asheville. 2 days later, a 4th suspect named Dewey Henry Coffey, who was in Maryland at the time, was also placed under arrest after he surrendered to police. All 4 men were members of a burglary ring, which was being investigated by law enforcement, and they each had past criminal records for such crimes as burglary, larceny, and breaking and entering. Dean Chandler had recently been arrested on unrelated charges and was potentially facing up to 10 years in prison for violating his parole, so in hopes of cutting a deal for himself, he decided to offer up information about the Durham family murders. Chandler claimed that he was responsible for casing the Durham residence and picking it out as the location for a burglary which involved Quesada, Guerin, and Coffey. However, Chandler maintained that he was not present when the murders took place, but when he met up with the other 3 suspects later that night, Quesada told him they had, quote-unquote, messed up the whole deal, and stated, quote, if they had waited 5 minutes later to come home, it would have saved them a lot of trouble, and us too, end quote. The arrest seemed to contradict Troy Hall's account of the phone call he received from Virginia, as she supposedly told him they were being attacked by 3 black men, but all 4 of these suspects were white. Indeed, when Quesada, Guerin, and Coffey were given polygraphs and denied any involvement in the murders, the results showed they were being truthful. When a pretrial hearing took place in June, the charges against Guerin and Coffey were dropped after a judge ruled that there was no evidence or probable cause to bring either of them to trial. But the charges against Quesada were not dropped because Chandler's wife testified that Quesada had confessed his involvement in the murders to her and threatened her entire family if she ever spoke to the authorities. In September of that year, a grand jury would hand down indictments against Quesada for murder and Chandler for being an accessory to murder before the fact. Both men were scheduled to go on trial in June of 1973, but it wound up being postponed at the request of the prosecution, and in January of 1974, they finally decided to dismiss the murder charges against Chandler and Quesada due to lack of evidence. In spite of this, Chandler wound up getting 5 years in a federal penitentiary after pleading guilty to a car theft charge, and he received a separate 8 to 10-year prison term on larceny and breaking and entering charges. Since the investigation into these 4 men hit a dead end, Troy Hall was looked at as a potential suspect. There was apparently a disagreement among investigators about the veracity of the phone call Troy received from Virginia, as some of them believed the call never even took place. If intruders had entered the Durham residence and attacked the family, it seemed odd that Virginia would have chosen to phone her son-in-law instead of the police. Furthermore, after hearing Virginia's cries for help, why did Troy choose to drive to her house in a snowstorm rather than call the police himself? There were rumors that the Hall's marriage was not in a good place, as Ginny's parents were disappointed about her decision to drop out of university and had been pressuring her to leave her husband. Troy's alibi was that he went to the Appalachian State University Library at 5 p.m. and spent several hours studying there before he drove home and arrived at around 10 o'clock. He sat down to watch the Winter Olympics on television with Ginny, but when the bad weather caused their TV to stop working, they decided to put on some music before Troy received the phone call at 10:30. Library records did show that Troy checked out a book that night, though the exact time was not listed. There were also several eyewitnesses placing Troy in the library, but while one of his friends recalled seeing him step outside to take a break at around 8 o'clock, no one could really verify when Troy left. A forensic search of the Durham residence also failed to turn up any African American hairs, which seemed to go against Troy's story about the family being attacked by a trio of black men. Ginny wound up inheriting nearly $250,000 from her family's estate following their deaths, and was questioned extensively about the crime. She was very cooperative with investigators, and at one point agreed to undergo hypnosis in order to help her recall any details from having witnessed Troy's phone call. Even though investigators continued to have their suspicions about Troy, they became satisfied that Ginny did not have any knowledge or involvement in her family's murders. Troy and Ginny moved out of the county and wound up getting divorced in 1976. Ginny eventually remarried and moved to Washington State, but while new articles about this case have been published in recent years, Ginny and Troy have always declined requests for interviews. Some unidentified fingerprints were recovered from the Durham residence, and periodic searches are performed on the prints every few years to see if any matches can be made. However, there is apparently no remaining evidence which can be reliably tested for DNA, as the number of investigating officers who showed up at the residence that night may have contaminated the crime scene. So after nearly 50 years, the murders of the Durham family continue to remain unsolved. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. So I've covered my fair share of cases on this podcast involving missing or murdered families, but I have to say that this is one of the most baffling because nothing about this story makes much sense. I have no idea what the real motive was for these murders, but I believe that the weirdest thing is that the responsible party decided to commit this crime on a night when the area was being hit by a brutal snowstorm. This may have been a premeditated murder, or it may have been unplanned, but doing so in these weather conditions was a huge risk, because there were so many things that could go wrong. Hell, the discovery of the Durham's SUV in a ditch about a mile away from the residence might be evidence of this, because for all we know, the perpetrator may have been intending to steal the vehicle before they veered off the icy road. What was so important that someone felt they just had to travel to the Durham residence in such terrible conditions on this particular night? What could their possible motive have been? Well, the person who had the most to gain was Ginny Hall, since she wound up inheriting her family's estate. But it sounds like investigators are pretty certain she had nothing to do with it. Obviously, Troy Hall seems like a promising suspect, but in the long run, he really didn't gain anything from this crime. Troy and Ginny have always been under close scrutiny for the decision to travel to the Durham residence to discover the bodies on their own, but perhaps the most enigmatic character in this whole story is their neighbor, Cecil Small, who gave the Halls a ride to the murder scene. Cecil's role in this story is relatively minor, but he also happens to be linked to one of the most famous events of the 20th century. Yes, like I mentioned in the intro, this case has an unlikely connection to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. So just over 8 years before these murders took place, Cecil and his wife Mildred were driving back home after a cross-country road trip to California, but wound up having to stop in Dallas, Texas because of mechanical problems with their truck. On November the 22nd, 1963, Cecil drove into the downtown area to visit an auto parts shop and happened to catch a glimpse of the president's motorcade heading towards Dealey Plaza about a block away. Well, as I'm sure you're well aware, something pretty significant happened on this date, and sure enough, when Cecil arrived at the auto parts shop, a television set was broadcasting the news about President Kennedy being shot. Since this particular shop did not have the wheel bearings which Cecil's truck required, he was directed towards another auto parts shop on Dallas' south side near the Oak Cliff neighborhood, so Cecil headed there to pick them up. He claimed that he pulled over and stopped to ask a young man for directions, and since he was also heading towards Oak Cliff, the man asked Cecil for a ride. Cecil invited him into his truck, where the man soon introduced himself as Lee Harvey Oswald, who said he had just left his place of employment at the Texas Schoolbook Depository. When Cecil informed Oswald about the shooting which had just taken place, he said that Oswald seemed to be completely unaware of it, though he did acknowledge that a police officer had briefly stopped and questioned him when he left the depository. When Cecil opened up his glove compartment, Oswald noticed a .38 caliber revolver inside and mentioned that he owned a rifle with a smaller barrel that he would be willing to trade for it. Cecil agreed to the arrangement, and after they arrived at the auto parts shop, Oswald said that he would walk to his residence in order to grab the rifle and return in about 30 minutes to make the trade. Well, Cecil never saw Oswald again, and later that day, he heard the shocking news that Oswald had been arrested for the assassination of President Kennedy and had also fatally shot Dallas police officer J.D. Tippit in Oak Cliff a very short time after they parted ways. However, Cecil never contacted the authorities, and it was only after sharing this story with a friend of his years later when this person decided to contact the FBI. When FBI agents showed up to question Cecil, they disbelieved his story because Cecil had a faulty and inaccurate recollection of Dallas' streets and landmarks. In 1977, Cecil shared the story in a tape-recorded interview with a reporter who was planning to write a book about the Kennedy assassination, though it was ultimately never published. Cecil's encounter with Oswald was never officially verified, and he passed away in 1991. Now, the official version of events in the Warren Commission report is that after he shot Kennedy and left the Texas Schoolbook Depository, Oswald hopped on a bus, but after he became stuck in a traffic jam, Oswald decided to get off the bus and took a taxi the rest of the way to Oak Cliff before he crossed paths with Officer Tippit and shot him. Since Cecil always maintained that Oswald seemed way too calm for someone who had just assassinated the president, conspiracy theories have used this story as evidence that Oswald was not the actual shooter. Okay, so I'm certainly not going to imply that the murders of the Durham family have any connection to the Kennedy assassination, and even if his story about Oswald is true, I'm sure it's nothing more than a coincidence that Cecil Small happened to find himself embroiled in two separate crimes which took place years apart in two different states. But Cecil's colorful background just adds an extra element of weirdness to this story, as well as some ambiguity about whether he was just an innocent eyewitness or if he might have actually been complicit in the murders. There has been a lot of debate about the motivation behind Troy's decision to ask Cecil to give him a ride to the murder scene. Troy might have done so because his own car legitimately would not start, or the whole thing could have been a ploy for Cecil to function as an alibi witness. There are numerous documented cases where the killers have been the ones who, quote-unquote, discovered their victim's body in order to take suspicion off themselves, and sometimes they've asked an independent eyewitness to accompany them when they made their discovery so that they could put on a show pretending to act shocked and surprised. This could be the reason Cecil became involved in this whole saga to begin with, but if Troy was the killer, it's pretty remarkable that both him and Lee Harvey Oswald asked Cecil for rides right after they committed horrific murders. Talk about being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But of course, if Cecil completely fabricated his story about Oswald, then does that damage his credibility as an eyewitness in this case? The authorities never indicated that they believed Cecil had any knowledge or involvement in the murders of the Durham family, and that's probably true, but his presence just adds an extra complication to this story. But before we talk more about the theory of Troy being the killer, let's explore alternate possibilities. The Durhams had only been living in Boone and operating their car dealership for just over 2 years at this point, and were known for mostly keeping to themselves, so it doesn't sound like anyone had anything bad to say about them. It sounds like Bryce was a pretty honest, straightforward guy, and Virginia appeared to be the same way, and while Bobby Joe was described as being quiet and shy by his fellow students, he was also considered to be a very nice and polite young man who never caused trouble. Even though there were a number of rumors about Bryce being targeted because he had knowledge or involvement in illegal activity, these were never substantiated, but given the unusual manner of death, I can see why one would be inclined to believe this crime was some sort of organized professional hit. I mean, it would be one thing if all the victims had been shot or stabbed to death in a fit of rage, but someone went to the trouble of tying Bryce, Virginia, and Bobby Joe's hands behind their back before strangling them and submerging their heads in a bathtub filled with water. If you search online, you'll be able to find crime scene photos of the 3 bodies draped over the edge of the tub, and it's such a disturbing sight that you have to wonder if there's a reason they were murdered in this particular fashion. So during the early stages of the investigation, 4 suspects were arrested. Jerry Ray Quesada, Eugene Clarence Guerin, and Dewey Henry Coffey, who supposedly committed the murders during a botched burglary, and Dean Chandler, who claimed he was not actually present, but was considered to be an accessory since he picked out the Durham residence. While the murder charges against all 4 men were ultimately dropped, that was mostly due to the lack of evidence, and it doesn't sound like they were technically cleared or exonerated. But the big issue is that there doesn't seem to be anything linking these suspects to the crime, aside from the confession from Dean Chandler, a career criminal who was not exactly the most reliable eyewitness. He was facing a number of unrelated charges at that time, and a potentially lengthy prison sentence, so I could totally see him playing the role of jailhouse informant and completely fabricating the story in order to cut a deal for himself. You'll notice how he conveniently distanced himself from the crime by claiming that all he did was pick out the house for the other 3 men to burglarize, but was not actually present when the murders took place. Needless to say, there are a number of issues with this entire story. I mean, I know criminals are not always the sharpest tools in the shed, but it still strikes me as odd that anyone would decide to go through with this burglary on a night when the area was being hit with such a terrible snowstorm, particularly since these men all lived over 80 miles away in Asheville. According to Chandler, when he met with the suspects afterwards, they told him that the family would have saved themselves a lot of trouble if they had just come home 5 minutes later, which suggests that the Durhams were killed because they walked in on the burglary while it was in progress. However, the evidence at the house completely contradicts this, as the family had enough time to eat some baked chicken, pour themselves some soda, and sit down to watch TV after they arrived home. There were also no signs of forced entry, and the lack of wet footprints on the carpet almost seems to suggest that the Durhams opened the door and let their killer or killers into the house before they were attacked. And while I never saw this confirmed by any official news source, I did come across a blog which states that Chandler was actually in jail for another crime on the evening of February the 3rd, 1972, which, if true, completely debunks his story about having met up with the other suspects right after the crime took place. I know that polygraphs are not reliable, but I can't overlook the fact that Quesada, Guerin, and Coffey all managed to pass when they took them and denied involvement in the murders. I'm sure that if the state had one shred of evidence to take any of these 4 men to trial, they would have done so, but there's nothing to implicate them other than Chandler's unreliable confession, so I'm inclined to believe he made up the entire story. And of course, the fact that all of these suspects were white goes against the story that Virginia called Troy and told him the family was being attacked by a trio of black men, so now I think would be a good time to discuss the validity of this story. Now, since we're talking about 1972 technology, I have no idea if phone records would have been checked to confirm if this call actually took place. From what I can tell, Ginny did verify that she at least saw Troy answer the phone that night, and it sounds like she stuck to the same story even after she was placed under hypnosis. But we really only have Troy's word about what was actually said during the call, and if you're an experienced true crime follower, I'm sure some alarm bells went off the moment you heard Troy mention that the attackers were black. Black men are a popular scapegoat whenever someone commits murder and attempts to blame their crime on a non-existent individual. As a famous example, there's the case of Susan Smith, a mother who was charged and convicted of the murders of her 2 children after initially telling everyone they were kidnapped by an unidentified black man during a carjacking. There's also the story of Charles Stewart, a Boston man who fatally shot his pregnant wife before inflicting a gunshot wound on himself, and he caused a citywide furor when he claimed that a black man had shot them during a robbery. While Troy Hall's story has never been conclusively disproven, the population of Boone, North Carolina is overwhelmingly white, so if Troy was complicit, I can see why he would be inclined to pin the crime on a non-existent trio of black men. Hell, Troy specifically said that Virginia used the N-word when describing these men during the call, so if he completely fabricated the story, it seems even more egregious that he would falsely accuse Virginia of using a racial slur. I would actually be curious to find out if Virginia was known for using language like that, or if it would have been very out of character for her to use the N-word. Whatever the case, investigators were unable to turn up any hairs which appeared to be African American inside the house, though by their own admission, they did not do the best job preserving forensic evidence since a number of people went through the crime scene that night. Even so, this does cast doubt on the idea of the perpetrators being black. Another issue people have with Troy's story is the idea that Virginia would call him instead of the police if there really were intruders inside a residence. But like I mentioned last month during my episode about the disappearance of Antoinette Cayadito, things were different back in the days before 911 was the go-to method for calling for help. While 911 was initially implemented in 1968, the rollout took decades, and considering that only 50% of the United States had it in 1987, I think it's reasonable to assume that there was no 911 in Boone back in 1972. If Virginia needed to call for help, it's possible she did not know the number for the Boone Police Department, and back then, the quickest way to get through was to dial 0 and ask the operator to connect you. But if there were intruders in the house, and Virginia was in a panic when she got to the phone, perhaps the first number she thought to dial was her daughter and son-in-law. But even if this is what happened, why would Troy respond by traveling to the Durham residence rather than calling the police himself? Troy said that he initially thought the call was a prank, but hearing your mother-in-law phone you and say that her family is being attacked by a trio of black men is a pretty odd idea for a prank. I know that Troy and Ginny only lived 4 miles away, but since the driving conditions were so lousy, calling the police does seem like the more logical option if they really thought the Durhams were in danger. Now, I can understand the skepticism about Troy's story that he couldn't start his car, considering he had just driven home from the library and arrived there a short time earlier. But Troy maintained that the car wouldn't start because of the cold, as there wasn't sufficient power in the battery to turn over the engine. The main reason he asked Cecil Small for a ride was because Cecil's car was equipped with an engine block heater, which was kept plugged in to an outside receptacle, so there is a plausible explanation for why Troy did this. However, after they arrived at the Durham residence, I could see why it might look suspicious that Troy came up with the idea of entering the house through the garage when he discovered that all the doors were locked. This could provide a potential explanation for how an intruder was able to get inside when there were no signs of forced entry, but how many people besides Troy would have known about the entrance through the garage? However, before we accuse Troy of being involved in this crime, we have to look at the timeline and figure out if it was physically possible. It was confirmed that Troy spent a good portion of the evening at the library at Appalachian State University, and while one eyewitness recalls seeing him go outside at around 8 p.m., that doesn't necessarily mean he left at 8 o'clock. The Durhams were last seen heading towards their residence at around 9 o'clock, and Troy arrived home at approximately 10 o'clock. Well, Appalachian State University was located only about 3 miles from the Durham residence, so even if you take the bad road conditions into account, I guess it's not impossible that Troy would have had enough time to travel there, commit the murders, and arrive home during this window of time. However, you also have to take into account that the GMC Jimmy from the dealership was found about a mile away from the residence, so Troy would have needed to plant it there before he headed home. And there are also a lot of variables you have to consider. Did Troy know that Bryce would be picking up Virginia and Bobby Joe from the dealership, and they would all be driving home together? Did he know Bryce was attending a Rotary meeting at the ski resort? Were it not for the bad weather, the meeting probably would have ran longer than it did, so how could Troy have predicted when Bryce would arrive home? And once again, planning an elaborate murder plot, which requires you to travel to multiple locations on icy roads in a snowstorm, leaves an awful lot to chance. If Troy was involved, I think it makes a lot more sense that he would have hired someone to commit the murders rather than done so himself. After all, Ginny did verify that a phone call came into their residence at 10:30 that night. If it wasn't actually Virginia, perhaps the call was a signal from the killers to let Troy know that the job was completed and he could drive over to the residence and discover the bodies. But the problem with the hired hit theory is that it doesn't sound like Troy was an overly wealthy person, as he lived in a trailer park, and I'm not sure how much money he would have had to pay anyone. I mean, sometimes people are desperate enough to commit murder for very little compensation, but this came across as a very methodical crime, which did not appear to be the work of unskilled, low-level thugs. Interestingly enough, Bryce's Rotary meeting at the ski resort involved a presentation from the Green Berets, and some people have pointed out that the murder scene almost resembles a professional assassination from someone who would have received training similar to the Green Berets, though it's probably nothing more than a coincidence. I guess it's possible that Troy told the killers that their payment was anything they were able to steal from the house. While a deposit bag filled with money was left behind, I guess the perpetrator might not have noticed it or realized its significance. But on the other hand, it's really odd that they would go to the trouble of stealing valuable items such as silverware from the house, and then just leave them behind inside the abandoned SUV. From what I can tell, the only thing they really got was whatever was inside the Durham's wallets and pocketbook, and I have no idea how much money they were carrying at the time. Considering that the whole house was ransacked and barely anything was stolen, you get the impression the intruders were either looking for something specific or intentionally tore apart the place and staged the scene to give off the false impression of a burglary. It seems likely there was more than one person involved, and they all arrived at the house in their own vehicle. After the murders took place, at least one of the perpetrators decided to steal the SUV, while the others followed in their own vehicle. When the SUV got stuck in the ditch about a mile away, the driver subsequently left the scene in the second vehicle. But you have to wonder if the Jimmy really did veer off the road, or if it was intentionally planted there in order to give off the false impression that someone made a failed attempt to steal it before they crashed. In terms of possible motives for Troy to orchestrate this crime, it's been reported that the Durhams did not think too highly of him and had been pressuring Ginny to end their marriage. But Ginny and Troy wound up getting divorced only 4 years later anyway, and you get the impression that anyone sadistic enough to murder his in-laws because they were interfering with his marriage would not let said marriage end so easily. And if Ginny and Troy were involved in this crime together for the purposes of inheriting the estate, I'm not sure they would have gone through with a divorce while holding such a big secret over each other. Troy eventually went on to become an attorney, and as far as I can tell, he has never had any issues with the law, so you have to wonder how someone could commit a crime like this and then go on to live an ordinary, unremarkable life for the next 5 decades. I guess one of the reasons people are inclined to think that Troy was the mastermind behind the whole thing is because there doesn't seem to be anything else in the backgrounds of Bryce, Virginia, and Bobby Joe which would make them likely targets for murder, let alone on a night in which a major snowstorm took place. The detail which really sticks out to me is the lack of wet footprints on the living room carpet. You have to wonder if the Durhams let the perpetrator or perpetrators inside their house, and they proceeded to remove their boots before they attacked the family, which would explain why no footprints could be found. It seems more likely that the Durhams would let someone they knew into their residence between 9 and 10 p.m., but then again, they could have shown up at the door claiming they had gotten into an accident and needed help. Given the terrible road conditions, the Durhams would have had no trouble believing this story, and living in a small town back in 1972, people were less resistant about allowing strangers into their home. But if Troy wasn't the mastermind behind this crime, Who actually did it, and what could their motive have been? I think the entire case hinges on whether you believe Troy's account about the phone call. If he intentionally lied about Virginia's story about an attack by 3 black guys, then this means at the very least, he had knowledge about what happened. But regardless of whether or not Troy was involved, whoever was responsible essentially got away with the perfect crime, because this case continues to remain a major puzzler after nearly 50 years, and I'm not sure we'll ever learn the full truth about what happened. However, if you happen to have any information about the Durham family murders, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. We produced a bunch of exclusive bonus episodes for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3, and this past month, I released an episode about the kidnapping of Jolynn Rogers, who happened to be the sister of famous professional wrestler Jake the Snake Roberts, and this episode not only explores the crime itself, but the troubling history of Jolynn Rogers' entire family and her upbringing at the hands of an abusive father. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've also recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Patricia A., Mary, Mallory H., Kat S., Kayla A., Jody, Rachel W., and Tracy S. Thank you all so much for your support. Also, provided that it's safe enough to travel there, The Trail Went Cold is going to be appearing on Podcast Row at the very first CrimeCon UK, which is being held at the Leonardo Royal Hotel and Spa in London on the weekend of September the 25th and 26th. If you would like to purchase tickets to the event, we have a special promo code you can use to get a 10% discount. So to receive 10% off, visit crimecon.co.uk and enter the promo code COLD21. That's COLD21. In addition, I wanted to provide another reminder that I hold live streaming sessions on a platform called Get Vocal. Every Thursday night from 7 until 8 p.m. Eastern Time, I host what is essentially an after show for each week's podcast episode, where I have an interactive discussion about the featured case from said episode and answer questions and address comments from listeners. I always include a link to these sessions in our show notes, so be sure to check there for more information or visit getvocal.com. That's GETVOKL.com. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or a review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, or Spotify. So have yourself a good week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.